In Oxford's ancient cloisters, Inspector Morse confronts a peculiar mystery. Eleanor Hart lies dead beside her unopened birthday gift. What secret waited within brown paper that someone desperately needed her to discover? Join us for a tale where the past refuses to stay buried, and truth hides in plain sight among dreaming spires and whispered confessions. Where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps you're settled somewhere cozy with a warm drink. Or maybe you're walking through your own historic streets where old stones might harbor secrets of their own. I'd been sitting by the window of the perch for the better part of an hour, watching the evening settle over the Cherwell like a grey blanket someone had forgotten to fold. The punters moved past with that peculiar Oxford rhythm, all effort and no apparent progress, as though the river itself were flowing sideways rather than toward any discernible destination. It struck me then, as it often did in those quiet moments between cases, that the metaphor was perhaps too apt for comfort. The choir practice from St. Barnabas drifted across the water, voices lifting and falling in some piece I half recognized but couldn't name. Palestrina, perhaps, or one of those composers who understood that beauty arrives most powerfully when it doesn't announce itself. The sound layered itself against the damp stone of the college walls, creating harmonies that existed nowhere in the original score, but everywhere in the Oxford evening. I pressed my fingers against the cold glass and wondered, not for the first time, why I chose solitude when company might have warmed the edges of whatever it was I carried around like a stone in my chest. Lewis's call interrupted this particular bout of self-indulgence at precisely 8:15. I know this because I had been watching the clock above the bar, counting the minutes until I could reasonably order another whiskey without admitting to myself that the first had gone untouched. His voice carried that careful neutrality he employed when he suspected I was in one of my moods, which, to be fair, I was. An anonymous letter, he said, had been left at St. Aldate's sometime during the afternoon. Hand-delivered, no postmark, the sort of thing that arrives with its own small atmosphere of unease. Inside, a single typed line and a cutting from the Oxford Mail, yesterday's edition, folded with the precision of someone who understood the weight of presentation. The newspaper clipping was brief, occupying that modest space reserved for deaths that are notable but not quite newsworthy. Eleanor Hart, 43, development director at St. Friddiswide's College, had been found at the base of her staircase on the morning following what the paper described as a small birthday celebration with colleagues. The preliminary assessment suggested a tragic accident, a misstep on stairs worn smooth by centuries of academic feet, the sort of mundane catastrophe that transforms an ordinary Tuesday into something families remember forever. But it was the letter's single line that had prompted Lewis to interrupt my riverside melancholy. Ask why she never opened her birthday gift. I folded the photocopy twice, then once more, as though the additional creases might reveal something the words themselves withheld. The sentence carried the particular authority of someone who knew more than they were willing to say directly, a quality I'd learned to recognize in my years of listening to what people didn't quite tell me. There was something almost crossword-like about its construction, the way it offered information while simultaneously withholding it, demanding that the reader supply the crucial connections. The grammar troubled me as well. Past tense for Eleanor Hart, who would never open anything again. Present continuous for the gift, which presumably still sat wherever she had left it, wrapped and waiting. And somewhere in that temporal gap between what was and what remained lay the sort of question that made my fingers itch for a pencil and a proper puzzle. I paid for the whiskey I hadn't drunk and stepped into the November mist, which had thickened while I sat contemplating rivers and their reluctant progress toward the sea. The car park was nearly empty, save for a grey BMW idling near the exit, its engine running with the quiet efficiency of German engineering. The registration plate was too clean for a car that should have been accumulating the particular patina of Oxford dust. that fine mixture of ancient stone and academic ambition that settles on everything that remains stationary for more than a day. As I walked toward my own car, I found myself thinking about gifts and their curious relationship to time. A present exists in a state of potential until the moment it's opened, carrying within its wrapping all the possibilities of what it might contain. But once unwrapped, it becomes fixed, definite, sometimes disappointing. Perhaps Eleanor Hart had understood something about the nature of anticipation that the rest of us had forgotten. The BMW pulled away as I reached my Jaguar, its headlights sweeping across the wet tarmac like a lighthouse beam searching for something that might or might not be there. I made a mental note of the partial registration, old habits asserting themselves even when I wasn't entirely certain they were necessary, and settled into the familiar embrace of worn leather seats. The drive back to Oxford proper took me past St. Fridswide's College, its medieval walls rising from the pavement like a rebuke to the modern world's insistence on straight lines and predictable angles. Lights glowed in a few windows, suggesting the sort of late-evening industry that characterized academic life. Papers to mark, lectures to prepare, the endless cycle of knowledge being transferred from one generation to the next. I slowed as I passed the main gate, noting the porter's lodge with its warm yellow light, and the way the shadows fell across the entrance courtyard. Somewhere within those walls, a birthday gift sat unopened, carrying its burden of unanswered questions. And somewhere else, someone who knew why Eleanor Hart had chosen not to unwrap whatever had been meant for her was going about their evening as though anonymous letters were not a feature of their world. By the time I reached my flat, the mist had transformed itself into a proper drizzle, the sort that seeps into your bones and makes you understand why the English have developed such an extensive vocabulary for varieties of dampness. I poured myself a proper whiskey this time and sat at my desk with a photocopy of the letter spread before me. Ask why she never opened her birthday gift. 7 words that managed to contain multitudes while revealing almost nothing. The sort of sentence that would have made a decent crossword clue if one could determine what exactly it was supposed to unlock. Outside, Oxford settled into its nightly rhythm of ancient stones and modern secrets, while somewhere in St. Fridswide's College, a gift waited in whatever state of suspension exists between giving and receiving. And I sat with my whiskey and my questions, feeling that familiar tug of curiosity that had always been both my greatest asset and my most reliable source of sleepless nights. The grammar of grief, I thought, was always more complicated than it first appeared. The morning after Lewis's call arrived with that particular quality of Oxford light that seems filtered through centuries of scholarly disappointment, pale, indirect, and somehow apologetic. We drove through cobbled lanes past colleges whose ancient stones had witnessed more secrets than any murder investigation could hope to uncover, their very architecture a testament to the slow, deliberate work of concealment that institutions perfect over time. St. Fridswide's presented its austere face to the world, the main quad a stark expanse of lawn already slick with morning dew. The porter's lodge smelled of tea and bureaucracy, that peculiar mixture of comfort and authority that characterizes places where power is exercised through the careful management of keys and information. Lewis, with his customary efficiency, led me through stone corridors that seemed designed to muffle both footsteps and revelations, up a narrow staircase worn smooth by generations of academic ambition. Eleanor Hart's rooms occupied the second floor of what the college optimistically called new building, though anything constructed after the Reformation qualified as recent in this context. The sitting room presented itself as a study in careful modesty. Shelves lined with books that appeared actually read rather than merely displayed. Furniture that had achieved that particular patina of institutional comfort, and a faint smell of rain that shouldn't have been indoors, an atmospheric detail that registered in the periphery of consciousness like a crossword clue. not quite grasped, but it was the mantelpiece that drew my attention with the inexorable pull of an unanswered question. There, positioned with deliberate care, sat a small brown paper parcel tied with string of the most utilitarian variety. The paper was crisp and unhandled, bearing no creases that might suggest eager fingers had tested its contents. The string maintained its original tension, knotted with functional efficiency. A granny knot, I noted, the inefficient cousin of the reef, the sort tied by someone who had learned their technique from bundling newspapers rather than any more delicate trade. Dr. Miriam Vale arrived precisely at 10, which I suspected represented her customary relationship with punctuality rather than any accommodation to our investigation. She possessed that controlled elegance that academic women of a certain generation cultivate as both armor and advertisement. Gray hair, arranged with strategic casualness, clothes suggesting taste without ostentation, and a manner of speaking that implied considerable thought had been given to every word before its release. Her account of the previous evening unfolded with methodical precision. The birthday dinner had been modest by design, she explained, because Eleanor disliked fuss. They had dined early at high table, returned before 10, parted company at the main quadrangle where Eleanor had appeared in excellent spirits, mildly flushed with what Dr. Vale described as a modest Italian red. The phrasing was careful. Over-careful, I thought, and something in the particular lilt she gave to the words "it was the last time any of us saw her" made me glance again at the parcel's untouched string. The U.S. had the shape of a circle, a comfortable collegial ring that seemed to exclude other possibilities. The Reverend Gideon Lyle arrived while Dr. Vale was still speaking, moving with that combination of diffidence and authority that characterizes clergy navigating secular territory. He murmured something about fragile souls and the mysterious ways tragedy visits even those most securely anchored in the world's affections. The sentiment was conventional, but delivered with genuine thoughtfulness about the theological implications of accidental death. Felix Dacre, the bursar, presented himself as a man who wore caution like a perfectly tailored suit, present in every gesture but so well fitted as to appear natural. He was younger than expected, perhaps 40, with the methodical manner of someone who approached financial matters with religious reverence. When asked about the dinner, he offered details with auditor-ready precision, but said remarkably little about Eleanor herself, as though personal observations fell outside his professional purview. Professor Julian Parr arrived last, bringing that atmosphere of languid authority that successful academics cultivate as both credential and defense. He possessed classical features that seemed designed for college brochures and moved through the room with casual ownership. When conversation turned to Eleanor's character, he offered what appeared to be spontaneous quotation. "Cleverness," he remarked with practiced ease, "is not wisdom, but something in the weight he gave the word not struck me as wrong. Not factually incorrect, but rhythmically false, like poetry recited by someone who understood meaning but had never grasped the music." Isla Rook, the librarian, proved most forthcoming, perhaps because her profession had taught her the value of preserving details others might consider insignificant. She was perhaps 35, with grave eyes and warm intelligence that suggested considerable time spent helping people locate what they sought, even when they weren't entirely certain what that might be. When I asked about Eleanor's habits, Isla mentioned almost casually that Eleanor had always disliked surprises, preferring to know what to expect from both people and circumstances. The observation lodged itself with particular weight, information that seems trivial until it proves crucial. Something in me remembered how some people only unwrap the past when entirely alone, safe from the possibility that their reactions might be observed and catalogued. The coroner's preliminary assessment, delivered later by telephone, confirmed what the scene suggested. Eleanor Hart had died from injuries consistent with a fall downstairs occurring between 10:30 and midnight on her birthday evening. The conclusion was reasonable. supported by physical evidence, and utterly unconvincing in ways I could not yet articulate. As we prepared to leave, I found myself drawn once more to the parcel. It sat with patient presence of a question awaiting its proper answer, wrapped in brown paper that had never been disturbed, tied with string that had never been tested. On the mantle's lip, a bead of dried water had left a chalky aura, evidence of moisture that didn't match Eleanor's carefully ordered room. The window latch bore the small, recent polish that a rag leaves when someone has gone after condensation, yet her umbrella stood conspicuously dry in its stand. Whatever lay inside that package had been intended for Eleanor Hart, but it had arrived too late to fulfill its purpose, leaving behind only the mystery of why she had chosen not to discover what someone thought she needed to know. The parcel's very presence was an absence, a gift withheld, a secret waiting patiently to be told. And I knew, with the certainty that often precedes understanding, that the answer to Eleanor Hart's death lay not in the violence of a fall, but in the quiet, unexamined contents of that brown paper package. The rain outside began to fall in earnest, a soft drumming against ancient glass that mirrored the quiet ache settling in my own thoughts. The cloisters of St. Fridswide's breathed their perpetual dampness, even when Oxford's sky promised something approaching brightness. Lewis walked a half-step ahead, his practical nature asserting itself against the college's atmospheric insistence on contemplation over haste. The stone corridors exhaled centuries of accumulated moisture, that particular institutional damp that seems to seep from the very bones of academic ambition. Somewhere a clock hesitated between striking and silence, while pigeons arranged themselves along the balustrade with the indifference of creatures who had witnessed too many scholarly crises to be impressed by another. We received the usual liturgy as we moved through the college's administrative heart. Benefactors carefully tended, bursaries delicately balanced, a heritage managed as if it were porcelain with hairline cracks. Old money and older secrets whispered from every corner, speaking in the coded language institutions perfect when they wished to sound innocent while edging toward the culpable. Felix Dacre's office lurked at the end of a corridor that had once promised medieval monks a clear conscience. The room smelled of dust and what I could only characterize as audited fear, that metallic anxiety that clings to ledgers when their figures are compelled to tell stories they would prefer to keep private. His radiator ticked with the resentful sound of old pipes questioning their continued usefulness, while ring binders stood at attention along his shelves, their spines labeled in handwriting too patient to suggest haste. Dacre himself wore caution like a perfectly tailored suit, present in every gesture, but fitted so well it appeared natural. The books balanced, he assured us, with careful emphasis, but not gracefully. It was not confession, merely observation that numbers reached their designated destinations by traveling back lanes. On his blotter, the faint ghost of words pressed by a fountain pen caught my attention. Blue-black ink pooled where the nib had scraped at a capital K, leaving that wintry bloom peculiar to institutional correspondence. The development office occupied a corner where medieval architecture met modern necessity with predictable awkwardness. Tom Ainsworth stood at a high table, curating his own silhouette with the theatrical precision of minor poets who understand that presentation precedes publication. His hair suggested recent finger-combing, his scarf tied with effortless care that had required considerable practice. His alibi wrapped itself around him like that scarf, patterned, faintly perfumed, unnecessary until a chill presented itself. The Cherwell Arms, he explained, had provided dinner and decent Australian wine, followed by conversation that had produced more laughter than the evening's circumstances warranted. Afterward, he claimed, he had driven straight home to Summertown, alone and responsibly sober. But my attention wandered to the keys in his hand, heavy enough to anchor a small boat, then to the scarlet Mini Cooper visible through his window. The parking permit on its dashboard bore Baliol's crest rather than saint. Friddiswide's, its expiry date belonging to last month. The detail offered no crime, but suggested the wrong kind of tidiness, the sort that emerges when someone has given excessive thought to covering tracks that might not need covering. Eleanor's desk revealed its secrets with the reluctant cooperation of well-organized systems. Her correspondence carried the easy warmth of someone who wrote quickly and trusted readers to supply missing connections. But among the donor files, a letter to Sir Bertram Cale struck a discordant note. The formality was wrong. Where Eleanor's other letters flowed with natural intimacy, this one maintained careful distance that seemed uncharacteristic. I slipped a copy into my pocket, knowing documents often revealed more on second reading, when the mind had time to notice what the eye initially overlooked. In her wastepaper basket, the husks of an interrupted day, a crumpled florist's envelope, an opera society flyer, a shopping list with olives crossed out and candles underlined. On her desk's edge, yesterday's Times crossword lay half-attempted, clues gapped in a way suggesting interruption rather than surrender. One entry had been penciled lightly, then erased. Gift, 7 letters. The faint trace of endowed remained, a palimpsest of thought she hadn't committed to ink. Mrs. Pettifer at the Porter's Lodge possessed that invaluable institutional gift of noticing everything while appearing to notice nothing. She remembered the grey BMW near Edda Building after 11 the previous evening, unfamiliar, unusually clean, idling with the patient hum of successful middle management. The same BMW, perhaps, that had waited in the Perch car park while I contemplated whiskey and its placebo effects. Walking back through the damp cloisters, I found myself returning to the parcel on Eleanor's mantel and the anonymous letter's unhelpful imperative. Ask why she never opened her birthday gift. The gift existed in curious temporal suspension, both object and subject, both present and withheld, carrying within its brown paper, wrapping all the potential meanings that remained unrealized. What sort of birthday invites a secret? What kind of celebration concludes with a present that remains unwrapped, carrying its burden of unanswered questions into the night? The college bells chimed the hour, their bronze voices echoing off stones that had heard similar questions for centuries. The ghosts of St. Fridswides, fellows from ages that never learned tact, seemed to lean slightly from their portraits as we passed. In Eleanor's room once more, I stood before the parcel without touching it. The address was written in handwriting neither careless nor delicate, the sort that belonged to someone who understood the weight of presentation. The room retained that stillness of a library where one book has been shelved incorrectly. A small thing, but small things in Oxford have started wars and marriages alike. The coroner's preliminary view lingered in the air like something one could taste. Shallow stairs, a misstep, modest Italian red suggesting good temper and gravity had conspired. Tragic, certainly. Persuasive, not quite. As we prepared to leave, the college cat crossed my path and declined eye contact. A student ran across the lawn because no one was watching. In the refectory's long glass, my reflection appeared older than I felt, which seemed the wrong way round. But the parcel remained, patient as a crossword clue waiting for its proper answer, wrapped in brown paper that had never been disturbed, tied with string that had never been tested. The station at St. Aldate's wore its evening atmosphere like a comfortable old coat, fluorescent lights humming their institutional lullaby while the radiators clicked their Morse code of expanding metal. I settled at my desk with Eleanor Hart's correspondence spread before me like evidence awaiting judgment. Each document a potential oracle, if only one possessed the patience to ask the proper questions. The donor letter to Sir Bertram Cale lay atop the pile, innocent as fresh snow until examined with the sort of attention that reveals hidden footprints. The first reading had registered nothing more than institutional courtesy, the usual delicate dance between gratitude and expectation that characterized academic fundraising. But second readings, often discover what first readings excuse, and this letter began to reveal its secrets with the reluctant cooperation of a crossword clue finally surrendering to patient analysis. The salutation betrayed itself first. What had originally been the warmer "Dear Sir Bertram" had been altered to the considerably cooler "Dear Sir Bertram Cale." The change was subtle, achieved through careful overtyping, but the mechanical evidence remained. The K sat a whisper higher on the line, the spacing tightened for the extra surname, and the ribbon's ink turned suddenly lighter, as though a different hand had stepped in with a different machine, or the same ribbon had been advanced after correction fluid and frustration. More telling was the closing, altered from "yours sincerely" to "yours faithfully," a curious migration toward formality for someone supposedly on comfortable terms with a long-standing benefactor. Eleanor's other correspondence flowed with natural warmth. This letter maintained the careful distance of diplomatic correspondence. A small smear of lighter ink caught the office lighting at an angle, blue-black bleeding into the paper's weave, where impatience had met still-wet correction. The faint misalignment was barely perceptible, but once noticed, it suggested the document's history. Someone had retyped portions after Eleanor's initial draft. Someone who understood institutional politeness but lacked her natural voice. In Oxford, we pretend that palimpsests are charming artifacts of scholarly tradition. They are not. They are admissions of deceit written in a learned hand. And this letter was, undoubtedly, a palimpsest. One text imposed upon another, truth buried beneath the archaeology of alteration. I folded the letter twice and slipped it into my jacket pocket, where it settled against my ribs like a small, persistent question. Outside, Oxford's evening traffic negotiated ancient street patterns with modern impatience, while inside the station, Lewis typed his reports with methodical precision, understanding that accuracy was often more valuable than inspiration. The following morning found me in conversation with Professor Julian Parr, who occupied his leather chair with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being the most intelligent person in any given room. His office breathed centuries of accumulated scholarship, leather-bound volumes arranged with aesthetic rather than alphabetical logic, papers scattered with the strategic carelessness of productive minds. Parr retailed his recollections of the birthday evening with languid precision, his memory apparently refreshed by a night's consideration. He had attended a concert at the Sheldonian, he explained, Handel's water music, followed by what he termed a pleasant detour through Thomas Arne's lighter compositions. The program had included a note about music's capacity to outlive its creators, he remarked, and then quoted with practiced ease, "What survives of us is love." The misquotation struck me like fingernail on slate. I had kept Larkin close for too long to forgive that small elision. What will survive of us is love, the poem insists, and the auxiliary verb matters profoundly. It places us in the future's custody, not the present's complacency, carrying the entire weight of the poet's hope and uncertainty. Parr's version, rendered in confident present tense, betrayed either careless memory or deliberate alteration. For a classics professor, such imprecision suggested the sort of intellectual sloppiness that academics rarely forgive in themselves or others. The wrongness revealed a man who had read the program without hearing the music, who quoted literature as decoration rather than understanding. I mentioned nothing of the error, allowing Parr to elaborate on his evening's cultural enrichment while I filed the misquotation alongside the donor letter's suspicious formality. Both suggested careful preparation, the sort of attention to detail that emerges when someone has given considerable thought to constructing a particular narrative. Yesla Rook appeared at my office later that afternoon, carrying a slim volume with the apologetic air of someone bearing potentially unwelcome news. Eleanor had borrowed the book 3 weeks earlier, she explained, a battered school edition of Catullus that had survived decades of undergraduate attention. The binding had achieved that particular flexibility that comes from being genuinely read rather than merely consulted, its pages soft with handling and marked with the marginalia of generations who had wrestled with Latin's unforgiving precision. The inscription on the flyleaf had faded to the point where it wore the years like watercolor. J. Wren, St. Fridwides, 1979, written in fountain pen ink that had once been blue-black but had surrendered to time's patient alchemy. But it was the marginalia that caught my attention, particularly in a translation of Catullus 85, where someone had traced faintly in pencil the acrostic J. Wren, as if the letters wished to be discreetly remembered without announcing themselves to casual readers. The translation itself was elegant, more flowing than standard academic versions, with particular attention to the poem's emotional undertones. Whoever had rendered Catullus into English had possessed both linguistic skill and intuitive understanding of the poet's psychological complexity. The acrostic was not the work of someone cultivating cleverness for its own sake, but rather carried the breadcrumb instinct, leave a trail in case the forest grows too dense for easy navigation. The name Julia Wren resonated with a faint echo, a name I felt I ought to know but could not immediately place. The careful, almost clandestine nature of its inscription suggested a desire for discretion, a wish for the name to endure without being overtly proclaimed. It was a secret tucked away in plain sight, the sort of quiet puzzle that had always drawn me like gravity draws falling objects. Walking home through Oxford's evening streets, I carried the Catullus volume and the donor letter like twin puzzles awaiting their proper solution. The college bells chimed the hour, their bronze voices echoing off stones that had heard similar questions for centuries. Somewhere in the intersection of Latin poetry and institutional correspondence lay the beginning of an answer to why Eleanor Hart had never opened her birthday gift. At my desk with proper whiskey for company, I arranged the evidence in careful sequence. The altered letter, Parr's misquoted Larkin, the acrostic hidden in ancient verse. They were pieces of a mosaic, disparate fragments that hinted at a larger, as yet unseen picture. The parcel on Eleanor's mantle began to tremble, not physically but in implication, carrying within its brown paper wrapping all the potential meanings that remained unrealized. The morning arrived with that particular quality of Oxford light that seems filtered through centuries of accumulated disappointment, pale, indirect, and somehow apologetic for its own existence. I unfolded the Times at my kitchen table, allowing the crossword to occupy that part of the mind which prefers measured difficulty to the ungovernable complexities of actual life. 7 across presented itself with characteristic smugness. Talent once, gift now, and perhaps both. The answer announced itself with satisfying inevitability. Endowed. 7 letters that managed to encompass natural ability, financial benefaction, and the peculiar academic currency of inherited privilege. I filled in the squares, with mechanical precision, though the satisfaction felt oddly hollow, as if the grid had surrendered too easily to deserve proper victory. The clue lingered as I walked through Oxford's damp streets toward St. Fridwides, its wordplay echoing the themes clustering around Eleanor Hart's death like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Talent, gift, endowment, words that shifted meaning depending on context, their significance as mutable as shadows cast by moving clouds. In Oxford, such linguistic multiplicity was architecture rather than accident, the careful construction of meaning within meaning that allowed institutions to speak in several voices simultaneously. Isla Rook waited in the library's reading room, where morning light filtered through ancient glass to illuminate dust motes dancing with the patience of academic inquiry. She possessed that particular gravity librarians cultivate when they have discovered something they suspect might matter, carrying herself with the careful authority of someone who understood that information, properly handled, could alter the trajectory of human understanding. She led me through the stacks to a corner where returned books waited in neat piles for their proper reshelving, each volume a small refugee seeking its designated home. From beneath modern histories, she extracted a thin blue diary, its cover faded to the color of winter sky, and bearing the simple inscription, Julia Wren, St. Fridswide's, 1979 in fountain pen ink that had achieved the particular patina of age. The diary opened with a reluctant cooperation of bindings that had learned to protect their secrets through decades of careful neglect. Julia Wren had possessed neat handwriting, the sort that belonged to someone who understood legibility as courtesy extended to future readers. Her entries chronicled the ordinary, extraordinary of undergraduate life. Lectures attended, essays submitted, the small social negotiations that constitute any Oxford term's real education. But it was the absence that spoke most eloquently. May morning, that celebration when Oxford pretends to be pagan for a few hours, should have merited pages of description. Instead, a neat gap interrupted the diary's chronology. A page cleanly torn with surgical precision, leaving behind only faint impressions of words pressed through from the missing sheet. The excision had been deliberate, performed by someone who understood exactly what needed to disappear from the historical record. Eleanor had requested the diary a fortnight earlier, Ella admitted with apologetic air. She had mentioned something about a centenary display, one of those institutional exercises in selective memory that colleges undertake to celebrate heritage while editing awkward chapters. Eleanor had spoken of modest scandals, the sort of historical embarrassments that acquire charm through temporal distance but remain capable of causing contemporary discomfort. On the diary's inside cover, someone had glued a small poem, the easy sort of verse that school children compose when demonstrating understanding of meter and rhyme. The lines themselves were forgettable, conventional sentiments about friendship and loyalty, rendered incompetent but uninspired couplets. But reading vertically rather than horizontally revealed the poem's true purpose. The first letters of each line spelled Felix with deliberate clarity, a message carried across years when direct communication had become impossible. I did not say anything at all for a long moment, allowing implications to settle like sediment in still water. Felix Dacre, the careful bursar, who wore caution like perfectly tailored clothing, had somehow earned his own acrostic in Julia Wren's diary from 1979. The poem was both declaration and concealment, a love letter written in code simple enough for its intended recipient to decode, but subtle enough to escape casual notice. From the same archival box, Ella produced a photograph carrying its own burden of historical testimony. The image captured a punt party from that spring of 1979, one of those carefully arranged social gatherings where Oxford's various tribes temporarily suspended territorial disputes in favor of shared intoxication. At the photograph's edge, almost cropped from the frame, stood a young Felix Dacre. Recognizable, despite intervening decades, his careful nature already evident in posture and expression. But Julia Wren commanded the photograph's center, her smile carrying that particular quality of someone who knew more than the men in her immediate vicinity suspected. She possessed intelligence that announced itself through restraint rather than display, understanding that true power often resided in allowing others to underestimate one's capabilities. Her hand rested casually on the punt's cushions, but her eyes suggested someone cataloging details for future reference. The photograph's composition told its own story of social hierarchies and romantic geometries. Other figures clustered around Julia with gravitational pull that certain people exert simply by existing, but Felix remained at the periphery, watching rather than participating, already displaying the observer's instincts that would serve him well managing other people's financial affairs. As I studied the image, the unopened parcel on Eleanor's mantle began to tremble, not physically but in implication. The gift existed in curious suspension between past and present, carrying within its brown paper wrapping secrets that someone had hoped Eleanor would discover, but which she had chosen to leave wrapped. The diary, the photograph, the acrostic poem, they formed a constellation of evidence pointing toward connections reaching back through decades to touch the present with fingers that still carried the chill of old scandals. The torn page spoke volumes through its absence. May morning belonged to music and misjudgment, when bodies occupied rooftops, at daybreak, and the city filled with faithful and hungover alike. Julia had excised the day when both sang in harmony, or someone had done it for her, understanding that certain memories required surgical removal from the historical record. Walking back through Oxford's ancient streets, I carried the diary and photograph like pieces of a puzzle, finally beginning to reveal its proper shape. The college bells chimed the hour, their bronze voices echoing off stones that had witnessed similar revelations across centuries. Somewhere in the intersection of 1979 and the present moment lay the answer to why Eleanor Hart had never opened her birthday gift, and why someone had felt compelled to send an anonymous letter asking the proper question. The grammar of memory, I reflected, was always more complicated than it first appeared, especially when institutions had spent decades perfecting the art of selective forgetting. The morning arranged itself with that particular quality of Oxford light that seems designed for scholarly revelation, pale, indirect, yet somehow illuminating. On my desk lay the accumulated evidence of our investigation. Julia Wren's thin blue diary, the battered Catullus volume, and a photocopied paper that had once established Professor Julian Parr's academic reputation. Lewis stood by the window, watching rain perform its ancient negotiations with stone and glass, while I prepared to follow the line that begged to be pursued. We had learned to distrust such lines, those investigative paths that present themselves with indecent eagerness. Yet sometimes the obvious trail proves genuine, and this morning the evidence assembled itself with mechanical precision around Professor Parr's scholarly sins. The Catullus volume revealed its secrets when subjected to proper scrutiny. Beyond the acrostic spelling J. Wren, a second inscription lurked on the final page. Translation notes, J.W., Hilary Term, 1979. The handwriting was careful, scholarly, belonging to someone who understood that marginalia might outlive memory. More damning was the translation itself, which possessed qualities rarely found in undergraduate work. Sensitivity to Latin's emotional undertones, an ear for English rhythm that suggested genuine poetic instinct rather than mechanical competence. Julia Wren had preferred certain cadences, particular ways of rendering Latin's compressed emotion into flowing verse, the sort of stylistic choices that constitute intellectual fingerprints. I retrieved Professor Parr's early paper from the college archives, Catullus and the Grammar of Desire, published in Classical Quarterly 3 years after Julia's graduation. The piece had established his reputation, earning praise for what reviewers termed its remarkable intuitive understanding of the poet's psychological complexity. Reading it alongside Julia's marginalia revealed uncomfortable parallels. Not crude theft, but something more subtle and perhaps more damaging, the appropriation of insight, the transformation of another's intellectual discoveries into one's own scholarly currency. The translation techniques were identical. That peculiar turn of phrase, that specific synonym that elevated translation from mere accuracy to something approaching art. Julia's innovations appeared throughout Parr's celebrated work. Academic plagiarism rarely announces itself through obvious copying. It operates through the theft of methodology, the borrowing of another's way of seeing, that transforms borrowed insight into apparently original scholarship. Motive bloomed with satisfying inevitability. Eleanor Hart, preparing materials for the college's centenary exhibition, had discovered Julia Wren's diary and recognized the implications of its contents. The torn page from May Morning suggested scandal, but the translation notes pointed toward something potentially more devastating. The revelation that one of Oxford's most respected classicists had built his early reputation on undergraduate work he had never acknowledged. Eleanor's formal letter to Sir Bertram Cale began to make sense. She had been preparing to make quiet trouble, the sort of discreet institutional pressure that allows scandals to be managed rather than exposed. For Professor Parr, whose reputation was delicate fabric woven from decades of careful scholarship, even a gentle tug might unravel everything. Academic careers survive many sins, but intellectual dishonesty is rarely forgiven, particularly when it involves the exploitation of student work. His alibi at the Sheldonian proved thin as vellum when examined with proper attention. I remembered Parr's misquoted Larkin. What survives of us is love rather than the proper. What will survive of us is love. The error was elegant proof that he had read the concert program without hearing the music, constructing his cultural evening from printed materials rather than lived experience. No one who had actually attended would have mangled Larkin so confidently, particularly not a professor whose professional life depended on precision with literary texts. A visit to the Cherwell Arms yielded the sort of flourish that makes detection temporarily satisfying. The register revealed that a room had been taken on the evening of Eleanor's birthday dinner, booked under the name Parry with 2 R's, a small alteration that suggested someone familiar with the establishment's casual approach to identification. The handwriting leaned forward with characteristic impatience, the wise tail hooked with that particular flourish I'd noticed in Parr's marginalia. Mrs. Henderson, the college caretaker, possessed that invaluable institutional gift of noticing everything while appearing to notice nothing. She thought she had seen Professor Parr slip away from High Table during the port, heading toward the Edda building where the grey BMW had been spotted. Her uncertainty was precisely the sort that suggested accuracy rather than invention. Witnesses who claim absolute certainty are often the least reliable. The solution assembled itself with mechanical precision. Eleanor had discovered Parr's early plagiarism through Julia Wren's diary and translation notes. She had arranged to meet him privately, perhaps offering the sort of discreet accommodation that allows institutions to manage embarrassing revelations without public scandal. Parr, understanding that his entire career balanced on Eleanor's discretion, had attended the meeting with desperation disguised as academic charm. The conversation had gone badly. Eleanor had proven less accommodating than hoped. A moment of panic had led to a clumsy push on shallow stairs, worn smooth by centuries of academic ambition. The unopened parcel became mere prop in this reconstruction, ignored in the aftermath of violence because its contents were irrelevant to the immediate crisis. I could almost sign it off. Plagiarism, exposure, murder disguised as mishap. The narrative satisfied every requirement of logical detection, explaining motive, opportunity, and the careful construction of false alibis. Lewis nodded with professional approval, understanding that we had assembled a case capable of surviving judicial scrutiny. But the solution pleased the intellect, like a well-filled crossword grid, while worrying the heart like poetry that refuses to scan properly. Something remained wrong, not factually but rhythmically, like a line of verse that contains the correct number of syllables but falls flat when read aloud. The case was too neat, too satisfying in its academic ironies. Real crime rarely arranges itself with such thematic coherence, and real criminals seldom leave trails that point so directly toward their guilt. The parcel on Eleanor's mantel continued to trouble my peripheral vision, carrying within its brown paper wrapping implications that extended beyond Professor Parr's scholarly sins. The anonymous letter's imperative, "Ask why she never opened her birthday gift," suggested knowledge that went deeper than academic fraud, touching on secrets that predated Parr's arrival at the college by years. As evening settled over Oxford like a familiar disappointment, I sat with the assembled evidence and felt the peculiar dissatisfaction that accompanies solutions that explain everything except what actually matters. The grammar of guilt, I reflected, was always more complicated than it first appeared, particularly when the accused possessed the intelligence to construct alibis, but lacked the instincts to avoid leaving better clues behind. Outside, the college bells chimed the hour with their ancient authority, while somewhere in the intersection of past and present, truth waited with the patience of unopened gifts. The grid was filled, yes, but poetry teaches distrust of convenience, and I had learned to wait for rhythm to assert its truth over logic's mechanical satisfactions. The Cherwell Arms occupied that peculiar Oxford territory where discretion masqueraded as hospitality, where the river's patient murmur provided cover for conversations that required privacy without scandal. I returned alone as evening settled over the water like a familiar disappointment, the inn's windows glowing with that amber light that promises warmth without quite delivering it. The register sat behind the bar with the minor authority of beer-stained scripture, its pages bearing witness to the sort of temporary accommodations that Oxford's more complicated residents occasionally required. I let my finger move down past the parry entry, noting the forward-leaning hand, the habit of slicing the tail of each Y as a tidy hook, handwriting that suggested someone who wrote quickly but with careful attention to presentation. The script possessed that particular quality of academic penmanship, legible enough for professional purposes, but carrying subtle personal flourishes that revealed character beneath competence. Then I turned the page to nothing in particular, allowing my attention to wander across entries that meant nothing to our immediate investigation, but everything to the register's quiet testimony. It was an old investigative habit. Sometimes revelations hide not beside their obvious companions, but scattered among the irrelevant, waiting for patient eyes to discover their significance. Mrs. Pettifer emerged from behind the bar with that combination of bustling efficiency and encyclopedic memory that characterized women who had spent decades observing human nature at close quarters. She remembered the parry booking with a sort of precision that suggested genuine interest rather than professional obligation. Number 7, overlooking the river, booked for one night but occupied for considerably less time. 2 glasses had been left on the windowsill, she mentioned with careful neutrality, both bearing residue of red wine, though only one showed lipstick traces. The detail lodged itself with particular weight, evidence of a meeting rather than solitary occupation. More telling was her observation about the door, which had not quite latched when she passed in the corridor the following morning. The mechanical failure suggested either faulty hardware or human carelessness, and Mrs. Pettifer's tone implied she suspected the latter. Tom Ainsworth materialized while I was contemplating these domestic mysteries, approaching with that mixture of resignation and defiance that characterizes poets who have been caught in deceptions they had considered sophisticated. His appearance carried the faint dishevelment of someone who had spent considerable time rehearsing confessions that never quite satisfied their own standards of honesty. When pressed with gentle insistence, he admitted that he had met Eleanor at the Cherwell Arms on several occasions over recent months. Their conversations, he explained with careful precision, had centered on the possibility of leaving Oxford, of pursuing lives that existed beyond the university's gravitational pull. They had discussed poems that would not be written within Oxford's ancient walls, creative works that required distance from institutional expectations to achieve authentic voice. Eleanor had spoken of development work as temporary necessity rather than permanent calling, he said, a way of accumulating resources for eventual escape. His own poetry, he admitted with becoming modesty, had never quite found its proper form within the university's literary culture. There had been wine, he conceded, and the shared melancholy of 2 souls who felt themselves outsiders in a world that prized conformity above authenticity. When I suggested that the 2 hours in Paris had been intended not to disguise Eleanor's identity, but to cast a net over someone else, Tom's complexion achieved that particular shade of embarrassment that accompanies exposure of schemes one had considered clever. The blush reached his neck and made brief residence in his ears. He had believed himself sophisticated. He had only been transparent. The false name had been Eleanor's suggestion, a small conspiracy designed to implicate Professor Parr should their meetings require later explanation. It was the sort of minor deception that lovers devise when they believe themselves more intelligent than their circumstances warrant, a literary flourish applied to what was essentially ordinary human need for privacy. Tom possessed fists. I noted their size and the slight scarring that suggested familiarity with physical confrontation, but lacked the moral force necessary for murder. His temperament ran toward passionate declaration rather than calculated violence, the sort of character that writes angry letters rather than pushing people down staircases. Still, red wine stains on his white cuff and what appeared to be juvenile approach to romantic disappointment made for appetizing distraction. Suspicion flirted briefly in his direction, entertained by the possibility that Eleanor's refusal to abandon Oxford for uncertain literary adventures might have provoked something more dangerous than wounded pride. But the distraction proved temporary, dissolving under practical consideration, like sugar in rain. Tom's emotional investment in Eleanor appeared genuine rather than possessive, characterized by romantic idealism that sought to rescue rather than control. His alibis, while not impeccable, possessed the casual inconsistency that suggests truth rather than careful construction. Lewis's telephone call arrived precisely when I was beginning to appreciate the pub's capacity for comfortable solitude. His voice carried that careful neutrality he employed when delivering news that might prove either salvation or complication. He had spoken to Professor Parr's neighbor, a Mrs. Whitmore, whose chronic insomnia had proven occasionally valuable public service. Mrs. Whitmore kept detailed mental records of vehicular movements, noting arrival and departure times with the precision of someone who found patterns in other people's lives more interesting than the content of her own sleepless hours. Parr's car, a somewhat ostentatious vintage Jaguar, had remained stationary throughout the evening in question, its engine never disturbing suburban quiet until well after midnight, long after the parry entry had been made at the Cherwell Arms. The discovery undermined our carefully constructed timeline with surgical precision, revealing alibis where we had expected gaps. That neat case against Professor Parr began to slip apart like wet tissue subjected to persistent rain, each element that had seemed solid revealing itself as temporary construction designed more for convenience than durability. The plagiarism remained factual, the motive plausible, but the practical mechanics of murder dissolved under scrutiny. I felt the familiar irritation of truth that refused to be obliging, that declined to arrange itself according to logical expectation or narrative satisfaction. Detection often resembles crossword construction in reverse. Instead of creating clues that lead to predetermined answers, one must allow answers to emerge from clues that seem designed to mislead rather than illuminate. The parcel on Eleanor's mantle reasserted its presence in my thoughts with renewed insistence, carrying within its brown paper wrapping implications that extended beyond academic fraud or romantic disappointment. The anonymous letter's imperative, ask why she never opened her birthday gift, suggested knowledge that operated on deeper levels than scholarly rivalry or literary ambition. Walking back toward my car through Oxford's evening mist, I carried the weight of a case that had seemed solved but now revealed itself as merely beginning. The college bells chimed the hour with ancient authority, while somewhere in the intersection of past and present, truth waited with the patience of secrets that have learned to survive institutional memory. The grammar of deception, I reflected, was always more subtle than initial analysis suggested, particularly when multiple parties possessed reasons for constructing alternative narratives. The register at the Cherwell Arms had told one story, Mrs. Whitmore's insomnia had contradicted another, and Eleanor's unopened gift continued to carry implications that none of our current theories adequately addressed. The river moved past the inn's windows with indifferent persistence, carrying Oxford's secrets toward destinations that cared nothing for academic reputation or romantic disappointment. While I contemplated the growing certainty that our investigation had only begun to approach the truth that someone had died to protect. The library's reading room possessed that particular quality of Oxford morning light that seems filtered through centuries of accumulated scholarship, pale, indirect, yet somehow illuminating details that might otherwise escape notice. Isla Rook waited at her customary desk, surrounded by the familiar architecture of books and silence, but carrying herself with the apologetic air of someone who had discovered more than she had intended to find. She produced an envelope with reluctant ceremony, the sort of manila container that institutions use to preserve ephemera deemed too insignificant for formal archival treatment, but too interesting for immediate disposal. Eleanor had requested access to these materials 3 weeks earlier, Isla explained, mentioning something about a centenary display and the college's obligation to present its history with appropriate complexity rather than comfortable simplification. The envelope's contents scattered across the reading table like fragments of a puzzle that had been deliberately disassembled to prevent easy reconstruction. Invitations to long-forgotten social gatherings lay alongside theater programs, their gilt edges tarnished with age, but their formal language still carrying the weight of institutional authority. A program from a May morning concert in 1979 advertised English madrigals that had presumably provided soundtrack to whatever drama had unfolded that spring. Restaurant receipts, ticket stubs, the accumulated detritus of a life lived within Oxford's social framework. But it was the scribbled note that commanded immediate attention, written on college stationery in handwriting that trembled with urgency rather than uncertainty. A single word. Don't. Nothing more, no signature, no context. Just that stark imperative carrying the weight of someone's desperate attempt to prevent something they could not bear to name directly. The paper bore St. Fritzwide's watermark, suggesting the note had been written by someone with access to official supplies, someone whose position granted them institutional authority. The torn diary page from May morning remained conspicuously absent, its removal creating a gap in Julia Wren's narrative that spoke more eloquently than any written confession. But Isla, with the meticulous instincts of a librarian, had preserved a photocopy of the facing page before returning the original to Eleanor. There, etched lightly in pencil, was a small arrow pointing toward the river, drawn with deliberate precision that suggested symbolic rather than literal direction. Beside it, the initials F.D. had been traced and retraced until they achieved the weight of obsession, each letter darkened with the intensity of someone who had returned repeatedly to contemplate their significance. The evidence assembled itself with mechanical precision around Felix Dacre's careful presence in Julia Wren's emotional landscape. The young accountant, who would eventually become bursar, had occupied the periphery of her Oxford experience in that punt party photograph, watching rather than participating, already displaying the observer's instincts that would serve him well, managing other people's financial affairs. But the arrow and initials suggested their relationship had progressed beyond professional courtesy into territory that required discretion. More damaging was what the ephemera implied about Julia's final weeks at Oxford. Library records, carefully preserved in Ila's methodical files, showed that rare volumes had been quietly deaccessioned during the spring of 1979, their removal from the collection handled with administrative efficiency that avoided attracting unwelcome attention. First editions of Milton illuminated manuscripts incunabula that represented centuries of careful acquisition, all processed for sale through discreet antiquarian channels. Their proceeds applied to debts that existed in that shadowy realm between personal and institutional responsibility. Felix Dacre, even then, had possessed access to both library assets and the financial mechanisms necessary for such delicate transactions. It was not theft in any crude sense, but rather the sort of institutional creativity that emerges when desperate circumstances require elegant solutions. Julia had discovered the pattern, her natural curiosity about library holdings revealing gaps that should not have existed. The scribbled note, "Don't," suggested she had attempted to warn someone, perhaps Felix himself, that exposure was imminent. The Reverend Gideon Lyle appeared while I was contemplating these implications, moving through the library's quiet spaces with that combination of authority and diffidence that characterizes clergy navigating secular territory. His resemblance to the girl in the photograph was immediately apparent, the same intelligent eyes, the same quality of observing more than one revealed, the genetic inheritance of people who understood that truth often required careful handling. He confessed with the directness of someone who had spent considerable time preparing for this conversation. He had sent the anonymous letter, he admitted, because 45 years of carrying his sister's secrets had finally exceeded his capacity for institutional silence. The knowledge had been corrosive, eating away at his faith in ways that prayer could not quite heal. Julia had been his younger sister by 3 years, he explained, brilliant in ways that Oxford had not quite known how to accommodate in 1979. She had discovered Felix's creative approach to library management and had planned to expose the scheme through official channels, believing that institutions possessed mechanisms for addressing such irregularities without destroying the individuals involved. Her faith in administrative justice had proven fatally naive. The parcel he had posted to Eleanor contained Julia's original diary, he said, complete with the torn page that detailed Felix's financial arrangements and her own growing awareness of their implications. He had hoped that Eleanor, with her position in development and her access to college records, might find ways to address the past's unfinished business without destroying lives that had been built on carefully maintained foundations. He insisted with quiet firmness that he had not seen Eleanor on the night of her birthday dinner, had not climbed her stairs, had not engaged in any physical confrontation that might have resulted in violence. His alibi possessed the ordinary authenticity of a man with no one to miss him between compline and morning prayers. The solitary existence of clergy who had chosen institutional service over personal attachment. I believed him, which was not proof but intuition sharpened by the plain cadence of grief that had carried his words. His sorrow possessed the particular quality of someone who had spent decades contemplating roads not taken, choices that might have prevented tragedy if courage had been summoned at crucial moments. He had loved his sister with the complicated devotion of siblings who recognize each other's intelligence while fearing its consequences. The photograph of Julia Wren smiled from the reading table with that quality of someone who had known more than the men in her immediate vicinity suspected. Her hand rested casually on the punt's cushions, but her eyes suggested someone cataloging details for future reference, understanding that truth often required patient accumulation of evidence before it could be safely revealed. But she had not lived to see that revelation, and Felix Dacre had spent 45 years building a life on foundations that required careful maintenance to prevent collapse. The unopened parcel on Eleanor's mantel had contained the means to destabilize that construction, carrying within its browned paper wrapping the sort of truth that institutions prefer to manage rather than confront. Eleanor's scribbled "don't" now resonated with new urgency. Perhaps a warning to herself against reopening wounds that time had not quite healed, or a desperate plea to someone else to halt a course of action that threatened to expose a past best left buried. Walking back through Oxford's ancient streets, I carried the weight of secrets that had survived longer than the people they were meant to protect. The college bells chimed the hour with their bronze authority, while somewhere in the intersection of past and present, Felix Dacre continued his careful navigation between truth and institutional loyalty. The grammar of long-held secrets, I reflected, was always more complicated than it first appeared, its syntax twisting through generations, its meaning often obscured by the very passage of time that was supposed to bring clarity. The evening had arranged itself around my flat with that particular quality of Oxford darkness that seems designed for solitary revelation, thick enough to muffle the world's intrusions, yet transparent enough to allow uncomfortable truths to emerge from shadows. I sat with a bottle of indifferent red wine, its contents offering little beyond the familiar comfort of liquid companionship to thoughts that required encouragement to achieve proper clarity. The scene of crime photographs lay spread across my table in a neat arc, their glossy surfaces catching lamplight like mirrors reflecting fragments of a puzzle I had somehow failed to solve during daylight hours. Each image preserved a moment of domestic order violently disrupted, frozen by the camera's mechanical eye before human instinct could impose its own version of what ought to have been. It was the first photograph that finally surrendered its crucial secret, though I had examined it dozens of times without registering what it actually revealed. The brown paper parcel, that persistent symbol of unanswered questions, rested clearly on Eleanor's piano, positioned between a stack of sheet music and a small ceramic owl. Not on the mantelpiece, not even adjacent to it, but centered on the piano's polished lid like a modest offering to domestic harmony. The displacement struck me with the force of revelation that arrives not as lightning, but as dawn. Gradual, inevitable, illuminating details that had hidden in plain sight. Every subsequent examination of Eleanor's room had found the gift relocated to the mantel, where it had assumed the prominence typically reserved for objects awaiting ceremonial unwrapping. Someone had moved it, and that someone had possessed both the opportunity and the presumption to rearrange a death scene according to their own understanding of domestic propriety. Felix Dacre's words echoed with new and damning significance. During our interview, conducted with Dr. Vale's brittle efficiency providing atmospheric accompaniment, he had mentioned noticing the gift on the mantel shelf. Mantel shelf, that old-fashioned word belonging to an earlier generation's vocabulary. He had even admired the economy of its wrapping, as though aesthetic appreciation of parcels was a natural component of discovering corpses. The observation had pricked me at the time before retreating into the background noise of investigation. Now it returned with proper weight, a man looking too keenly, too precisely at a scene he ought not to know. The word mantel shelf implied familiarity with the room's geography, while admired suggested attention extended beyond the courtesy owed to tragedy. One does not admire the way a bow is tied unless one has either tied it oneself or handled the ribbon with proprietary interest. From my coat pocket, I retrieved the photocopied-in register and placed it beside Felix Dacre's expense reports, documents I had collected during our examination of college finances. The juxtaposition revealed what individual examination had concealed, handwriting that shared crucial characteristics across both documents. The same forward-leaning italic that suggested someone who wrote with purpose rather than patience. The same habit of slicing the tails of letters like Y and G into tidy hooks, impatient to lift themselves toward the D next stroke. Most revealing was the consistent diminishment of capital letters, a leveling impulse that reduced initial authority to manageable proportions. The Parry entry in the Cherwell Arms? Register had been written by Felix Dacre, not Professor Parr. The double R represented more than disguise. It was deliberate misdirection, a small piece of taxonomic poison designed to implicate an innocent colleague should the clandestine meetings require later explanation. The false name served dual purposes, providing cover for whatever business required privacy, while simultaneously constructing a trail that led away from the actual participants. A telephone call to Lewis confirmed what I already suspected. The grey BMW, that immaculate sedan I had noticed at the perch during my initial evening of riverside contemplation, had been cited for parking violations near Edda Building after midnight on the night of Eleanor's death. The registration matched Dacre's personal vehicle, its suspicious cleanliness now explained as the sort of thorough maintenance that follows activities requiring discretion. The evidence assembled itself with mechanical precision around Felix Dacre's careful presence at the center of events stretching back 45 years. The young accountant who had quietly deaccessioned rare books to cover debts existing in the shadowy realm between personal and institutional responsibility had become the bursar who wore caution like perfectly tailored clothing. Eleanor's discovery of Julia Wren's diary had threatened to destabilize a life built on foundations requiring constant vigilance to prevent collapse. In the silence before I reached for the telephone, I found myself writing words on a scrap of paper with the compulsive precision that accompanies moments of clarity. Present, I wrote first, then crossed it out with a line almost deferential. Gift followed, then talent. The meanings overlapped like reflections on river water, none offering a steady face but each contributing to a pattern finally emerging from accumulated evidence. The morning's crossword clue returned with new resonance. Talent once, gift now, and perhaps both. Endowed had seemed obvious, but the wordplay suggested deeper layers. Felix Dacre had possessed talent once, the particular ability to manage financial complexities with creative elegance. That talent had become gift in the sense of something taken rather than earned, institutional assets converted to personal salvation. But the endowment had carried its own burden across decades, requiring constant maintenance of fictions that past irregularities had never occurred. Eleanor's birthday gift, the diary with its torn page and careful documentation, had threatened to transform that burden into exposure. The parcel's contents remained unknown to Eleanor because she had never been given the opportunity to discover them. Felix's visit had interrupted whatever private ceremony she might have planned, forcing him to choose between confession and something considerably more desperate. The photographs stared back with their glossy insistence on factual accuracy. The parcel had moved from piano to mantel, a small displacement revealing the hand of someone who understood the room's proper arrangement, someone who had visited before and knew where gifts were customarily displayed. Felix's mention of the mantel shelf had been unconscious confession, the sort of detail that emerges when familiarity overrides careful preparation. Outside, Oxford's evening traffic negotiated ancient street patterns with modern impatience, while inside my flat, the accumulated weight of evidence finally achieved the critical mass necessary for understanding. The grammar of long-held secrets was indeed more complicated than it first appeared, its syntax twisted through generations, its meaning often obscured by the very institutions supposed to preserve truth rather than manage its convenient disappearance. I reached for the telephone, knowing Lewis would answer with his customary efficiency, ready to transform revelations into the practical mechanics of justice. But for a moment longer, I allowed myself to contemplate the tragic symmetry of a case that had begun with an unopened gift and would conclude with secrets wrapped too carefully for too long, their contents finally demanding examination that no amount of institutional discretion could prevent. The wine remained indifferent, but it had served its purpose as companion to thoughts that had finally found their proper arrangement, like pieces of a crossword puzzle that had resisted solution until the crucial intersection revealed itself with inevitable clarity. The wrong shelf had become the right answer, and Felix Dacre's careful life was about to discover the weight of consequences deferred but never truly escaped. The college chapel possessed that particular quality of sacred space where voices instinctively lower themselves, not from reverence alone, but from understanding that certain confessions require whispered delivery to achieve their proper weight. Morning light filtered through ancient glass, with colors that had softened across centuries, casting patterns on stone floors worn smooth by generations who had sought absolution or wisdom in roughly equal measure. The very architecture demanded restraint, transforming even the most desperate pleas into something approaching prayer. Felix Dacre sat in the front pew with the careful posture of someone who had spent considerable time rehearsing this moment, though no amount of preparation could have equipped him for its actual arrival. He appeared ashen with that particular fatigue of a man who has known himself found, the profound exhaustion that accompanies the end of lifelong deception rather than its beginning. His hands, which had once managed the college's ledgers with meticulous precision, now lay folded with the defeated stillness of instruments that had outlived their purpose. I settled beside him without ceremony, allowing the chapel's acoustic properties to create the intimacy necessary for confession while muffling our conversation from potential institutional eavesdroppers. The silence stretched between us with the weight of accumulated years, carrying 45 seasons of careful management that had finally encountered a question requiring direct answer rather than administrative deflection. He had thought Eleanor would open the parcel after dinner. He began with voice barely disturbing the chapel's quiet reverence. The gift was meant to be discovered in private ceremony, its contents absorbed and contemplated before any decision about disclosure was made. He had hoped she would read what lay inside and come to him, not to the police, never to the authorities, but to him personally for the sort of decent English compromise that allows past irregularities to be addressed through institutional discretion rather than public scandal. He had counted on her understanding of the delicate balance that held such places together, the brass rubbing of the English conscience that transforms uncomfortable truths into manageable administrative challenges. But Eleanor had telephoned Sir Bertram Cale that afternoon. He continued with growing urgency, and the old donor had hinted with characteristic obliqueness that he knew about the 1979 sales. The conversation had been coded in the Mandarin way of institutional discourse, but its implications were unmistakable. Sir Bertram had mentioned the Wren Memorial Scholarship, established that same year with funds that had appeared in college accounts with convenient timing and elegant documentation. The tidy return of funds into a scholarship with an elegant name. The phrase made its quiet circle in the chapel like an administrative blessing that had curdled into curse. His debts in those days had been shapeless, he explained with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades organizing this explanation. Not wickedness so much as weakness with a ledger, the sort of financial obligations that emerge when young men with expensive tastes encounter limited resources and discover that probability is less negotiable than it initially appears. Gambling debts primarily, nothing criminal in the conventional sense, but obligations that demanded satisfaction regardless of their holder's capacity for payment. Julia Wren had discovered the pattern of deaccessioned books through her natural curiosity about library holdings, her questions revealing gaps that should not have existed. She had threatened to render his shapeless obligations into formal accusations, to transform private difficulties into institutional scandal through the simple expedient of proper documentation. Her moral certainty had been absolute, her faith in administrative justice touching in its naivety. She had written "don't" on college paper because she still believed that words could change events, that institutions possessed mechanisms for addressing irregularities without destroying the individuals involved. The evening of Eleanor's birthday dinner had unfolded with terrible inevitability. Felix had gone to her rooms after the formal celebration, hoping to plead for a hearing, for some private arrangement that might acknowledge past errors without destroying present stability. He had climbed those shallow stairs, worn smooth by centuries of academic ambition, carrying with him the desperate arithmetic of fear that had left him with no other solution he could bear to contemplate. She had listened with the patience that characterized her professional dealings, but her response had been disappointingly inflexible. The past required acknowledgement, she had insisted. The Wren Memorial Scholarship deserved proper attribution. Julia's death could not continue to provide cover for financial irregularities that had never been adequately addressed. Her voice had carried the authority of someone who had made decisions based on principle rather than institutional convenience. She had turned from him on the landing. He continued with voice beginning to fracture around the edges, dismissing his pleas with the sort of finality that admits no appeal. The gesture had been definitive, not cruel, but absolute in its rejection of compromise. The fall was not theatrical. He insisted with emphasis that suggested he had spent considerable time convincing himself of this distinction. A moment of panic, a hand extended in desperate supplication that became something else entirely when desperation encountered opportunity on stairs that had witnessed too many such moments across their long history. He had not meant it, he said, and the words carried the particular weight of the oldest sentence in the vocabulary of guilt. Every confessor since Cain had offered those same syllables, that same plea for understanding that actions had exceeded intentions, that consequences had grown beyond their original scope through some mysterious alchemy of circumstance and character. The parcel, untouched on Eleanor's piano, had told him in that terrible grammar that parcels sometimes speak that she had not yet read the past to its conclusion. The unopened gift had made him bold enough to adjust the room's arrangement, to move what he thought would look properly placed on the mantel shelf. That old-fashioned word he used as if correct terminology could sanctify deception. He had imposed the sort of domestic tidiness that emerges when shock encounters the need for normalcy, straightening frames and reknotting string in his mind, though he had touched neither. He had signed the Cherwell Arms Register as Parry with deliberate calculation, he admitted, pointing suspicion toward Professor Parr, who had once appropriated Julia Wren's scholarly insights without acknowledgement. Pride in small forgeries was both vice and diagnosis. He had managed paper, because paper obeys if you bully it with sufficient neatness, but people proved less amenable to such administrative solutions. Felix collapsed the distance to full confession with the visible relief of a man who had been holding his breath for decades, finally allowing himself to exhale the accumulated weight of secrets that had grown heavier with each passing year. His shoulders settled as though invisible burdens had been transferred to other hands, and for the first time since our investigation began, he appeared to occupy his own body without the careful tension that had characterized every previous encounter. The chapel's ancient stones absorbed his words with the patience that sacred spaces reserve for human frailty, while morning light continued its slow progression across floors that had witnessed countless similar moments of revelation and surrender. Outside, Oxford continued its daily business of education and endowment, unaware that one of its longest-held secrets had finally found voice in whispered confession that transformed institutional mystery into human tragedy, complete with all the moral complexity such transformations inevitably entail. Endowments, I thought, as we prepared to leave that sacred space. What we are endowed with, and what we endow in turn. Talent transformed into gift, money pressed into shapes that can be publicly admired, brown paper folded just so around secrets that refuse to remain wrapped. The grammar of consequence, I reflected, was always more complicated than it first appeared, its syntax twisted through generations until meaning itself required archaeological excavation to achieve clarity. After confessions, colleges performed their ancient ritual of institutional healing with the practiced precision of surgeons operating on their own reputation. St. Frideswyd's altered plaques with the delicate care of conservators, retouching damaged frescoes, finding language that both admitted and avoided with the sort of diplomatic eloquence that transforms scandal into something approaching educational opportunity. Flowers appeared in strategic locations, white lilies that spoke of remembrance without specifying what ought to be remembered, their seasonal beauty providing visual distraction from questions that might prove awkward for donors contemplating future generosity. The machinery of academic discretion engaged with centuries of accumulated expertise, transforming recent unpleasantness into manageable historical footnote through careful application of passive voice and strategic omission. Bronze nameplates were quietly updated, committee minutes delicately phrased, and memorial funds established with names that honored the dead without embarrassing the living. It was institutional alchemy at its finest, the transformation of human tragedy into administrative opportunity. The parcel was opened under order and ceremony 2 days later, in a small room adjacent to the senior common room where morning light entered at angles that seemed designed for revelation rather than concealment. Dr. Vale presided with her characteristic brittle efficiency, the college solicitor providing legal witness, while Isla Rook served as custodian of whatever historical materials might emerge. I stood as representative of secular justice, watching institutional memory finally submit to factual accuracy. The brown paper surrendered its secrets with the reluctant cooperation of string that had guarded more than anyone had imagined. Inside lay Julia Wren's thin blue diary, complete now with the missing page that had been carefully preserved between sheets of archival tissue. The torn entry detailed Felix Dacre's financial arrangements with devastating precision, each deaccessioned volume catalogued alongside the debts its sale had addressed, written in handwriting that remained neat throughout, suggesting someone who understood that documentation required legibility to achieve its proper effect. The school photograph was there as well, that image from the punt party where Julia Wren's smile carried what I now recognized as restrained revolt against a world that had not quite known how to accommodate her intelligence. She possessed that quality of observing more than she revealed, her eyes holding the particular brightness of someone who catalogued details for future reference while maintaining social pretenses that allowed information to be gathered without suspicion. Most poignant was Eleanor's note, written in her characteristic quick script but never read by her. "Not now. Perhaps tomorrow." The words carried the weight of someone who had recognized the implications of what lay before her, but had chosen to defer the decision about disclosure until she could consider all consequences with proper care. Tomorrow had never arrived for Eleanor Hart, leaving her intention suspended in the conditional tense that governs so many of our most important choices. Isla stood beside me during this ceremonial unwrapping, her grave eyes reflecting something between satisfaction and sorrow at seeing historical accuracy finally restored. She said something about wasted kindnesses, the sort of observation librarians make when they have spent too much time cataloguing human folly disguised as noble intention. I wanted, childishly, to take her to the pub and find a way to misquote nothing, to discover whether conversation might flow as naturally as her professional competence suggested. But the moment passed, as such moments do, leaving behind only the faint ache of opportunity deferred to more convenient circumstances that rarely materialize. Dr. Vale composed a tightly phrased letter to alumni, a masterpiece of institutional prose that managed to suggest improvement without admitting previous failure. The college, she assured contributors, remained committed to the highest standards while acknowledging that past practices occasionally required retrospective examination to ensure continued adherence to evolving ethical expectations. It was language that comforted donors while warning lawyers, verbs doing the heavy lifting while nouns disguised exhaustion. Professor Parr published a modest retraction in Classical Quarterly, acknowledging his debt to undergraduate research that had informed his early work. He retold his story with uncharacteristic humility, transforming potential scandal into an opportunity for reflection on scholarly collaboration. His reputation survived, perhaps even enhanced by this demonstration of mature self-examination, though I suspected he would never again quote poetry with quite the same languid confidence. Gideon Lyle preached once more on repentance, delivering a sermon that addressed recent events without descending into specificity that might prove uncomfortable for parishioners who preferred their moral instruction safely abstract. He retired his caller 2 terms later, citing health concerns everyone understood to be emotional rather than physical. The weight of carrying his sister's secrets for 45 years had finally exceeded his capacity for institutional service. Lewis telephoned during an opera broadcast, Puccini's voices providing atmospheric accompaniment to his inquiry about my general state of mind. He asked whether I was all right with that careful tone of a man who understands that such questions are rarely answered truthfully on the first attempt, I said yes, automatically, because the machinery of habit runs ahead of truth. Then I said no, because it seemed discourteous to the dead to pretend otherwise. Then I changed the subject to the weather, of which I had never been particularly fond, but which provided safer conversational territory than the actual contents of my thoughts. The evening walk home took me through a drizzle that appeared to have been invented specifically for this case. Finer than rain, more persistent than mist, designed to soak the edges while sparing the center, so that one arrived damp, not in obvious places, but in the seams where fabric met flesh. Oxford's ancient stones accepted the moisture with patient resignation, their surfaces darkening in patterns that suggested centuries of similar evenings when truth had emerged from institutional shadows to claim proper recognition. At my desk with whiskey for company, I wrote a single line on blank paper, a sentence I'd pretended might say more than I had managed so far. I crossed it out neatly, as if elegance of deletion might suffice for grace, then sat without music because music would have made the moment honest, and honesty, like surgery, is best performed either swiftly or not at all. The last thought, when it finally arrived, possessed not brilliance but the stubborn persistence of small truths that resist elegant formulation. Some gifts are addressed correctly and arrive precisely on time. They simply are not opened. The timing is perfect, the intention genuine, the recipient properly identified. But the moment passes, the opportunity remains unrealized, and what was meant to be revelation becomes instead a symbol of all the connections we failed to make despite careful preparation of circumstances designed to facilitate understanding. Eleanor Hart had received her birthday gift with perfect timing, Julia Wren's diary, arriving exactly when historical justice required acknowledgement and personal conscience insisted on truth-telling. But she had chosen not to open it immediately, deferring the decision until tomorrow's clearer judgment could guide her response. The gift had waited patiently through dinner and conversation, through Felix Dacre's desperate visit and its tragic conclusion, carrying its burden of revelation that would transform understanding if only someone possessed the immediate courage to break the string and unfold the paper. Perhaps that was the whole grammar of loss, not the absence of opportunity, but the presence of chances we recognize too late or lack the courage to embrace when they present themselves. The conditional tense that governs our most important decisions, always promising that tomorrow will provide the clarity that today seems to withhold. But tomorrow arrives wearing yesterday's clothes, carrying the same uncertainties we had hoped time would resolve. The drizzle continued its patient work against my windows while I contemplated the peculiar mathematics of human connection, how the right gift can arrive at precisely the wrong moment, how truth can be perfectly timed yet remain unexpressed, how the grammar of love and loss often depends less on what is said than on what remains. Like brown paper packages, carefully wrapped but never opened, carrying their secrets into whatever silence waits beyond our small, persistent music.